Hi, my name is Alex Weaver, better known as Uncle Alex to Luca and Leo Zappazotti. I'm coming to you from my workshop in Denver, Colorado to talk about Rube Goldberg machines. I built my first machine in high school physics and then went on to build several machines in college for a Rube Goldberg competition. Actually, even broke the Guinness World Record for the longest Rube Goldberg machine. So I guess some people consider me an expert. We'll try to get you guys off to a good start building your own Rube machines. So we're going to start off just talking about a few basic principles of Rube Goldberg machines. So the first one of those I'm going to talk about is reliability. And basically what that means is when you're deciding what steps or actions to put into your machine, you want to make sure you pick things that you know that can work consistently. That's where the reliability comes in. So you might consider things like rolling a car down a Hot Wheels track. That would be an example of something that's pretty consistent and reliable. If you have a track and it's the top stays in the same place and the bottom stays in the same place, and you use the same car, every time you roll it down, it should end up in the same place, going about the same speed. A bad example of reliability would be something like a paper airplane. If you were going to try to drop a paper airplane off a ramp and have it fly across the room and hit a target on the other side of the room, that could be really difficult to make reliable, because if there's any wind blowing through the room, or even the paper airplane itself gets its one wing twisted a little bit, it might fly way off course. So that would be something that's really difficult to get consistent and reliable. Another kind of in the middle example would be a ball rolling across a table. You can imagine that, like, if I have this ball and is on a table, it should go in about the same place, but having, if my ramp gets a little tipped, it might go one way or the other way, or if it hits a little crumb on the table or some other inconsistency, can really make a big difference in where the ball ends up. So in that case, you might, again, consider something like a Hot Wheels track, some sort of rail or guardrails, so that even if it's tipped a little bit to one side, it'll go along the guardrail and still make it to the end. So that's what I mean when I talk about reliability and consistency. So the next one we're going to talk about is setup accuracy, which is similar but in a little different part of the machine. So now we're talking about when you reset the machine, where you're putting your components back, where they start. So a good example is if you have something that's going to tip over like a domino. I'm going to use my little yellow man here. And let's say you're going to have something knock into it. Well, if you set it a little bit like this and something knocks into it, maybe it falls this way. Or if it's tipped backwards, then it falls this way. And so that's what I mean by setup accuracy. You want to make sure every time you set it up, you can do it basically exactly the same as you did before. So in this example, one good thing you might be able to do is put a little mark in front of each foot. So hey, if I put this right down and it goes up against those two marks, I know I've done it the same way I did last time, and it should work the same way it did last time. Another example, we'll go back to the golf ball. Again, if you had something that's going to come in and hit this golf ball, whether it's sitting here or here might make a lot of difference on where it ends up. So again, you could put some sort of mark so hey, I'm setting it right down where I did last time. The better yet example is to use something like a washer to make it foolproof. If I tape that washer down to this box, anywhere, as long as I'm close, anywhere I put that golf ball down, it's always going to end up right in the same place. And so that's the best case scenario, that when I put that down, if it's anywhere close, it's right, it's the same way it was the last time. And along those lines, consider fastening as much as you can down to some sort of structure or table, so that, again, I could have this washer, but if the washer moves, then again, we don't know that it's going to be in the same place. Same thing with the box. If you can actually tape the box down to a table and then you have your previous step taped to the table, now everything's going to be in the same position and it's going to work the same way that it did last time. Okay, so the next basic principle of Rube machines we're going to talk about is energy transfer. And that's really a lot of what a Rube Goldberg machine is about. It's transferring energy from one step to the next step, transferring potential energy. Like when you lift something up, you give it potential energy and then it rolls down, and that turns it into kinetic energy, which is energy of motion. I don't know if you've learned about that yet, but you should at some point. So one thing you need to consider as you're thinking about steps is, again, you have to transfer energy from one thing to the next. So you need to make sure you have enough energy in the first step to trigger the second step, and the second step to trigger the third step. So you might avoid trying to use things like tissue paper or a Kleenex or something falling, because it would be so light that you don't have a lot of energy to work with to trigger your next step. So you want to make sure you use things that are robust enough, heavy enough to trigger the next thing. The other thing, let's say you were trying to make a bowling ball roll down the table or something like that, and your previous step was like a ping pong ball. It's going to be really difficult to get a ping pong ball moving fast enough that it can hit a heavy bowling ball and make it start rolling. So you need to think about matching the size on your components so that you have enough energy to transfer from one to the other. But in that case, let's say you did start off with a ping pong ball and you wanted to move a bowling ball, you might consider having the ping pong ball hit a golf ball, hit a tennis ball, hit a baseball, hit a basketball, and then the bowling ball. So you're constantly increasing the amount of energy so that then you can move that really heavy item at the end. And so that's kind of how you can think about energy transfer through a Rube Goldberg machine. And you can also, not only just with weight, but also in like elevation. Let's say you start off on the floor and you want to move something on top of a table. Well, you can't have a ball roll uphill to get to that table. So you might have to think of other ways you can transfer that energy. Maybe it's with like a little catapult that flings something up to the table, or a string gets pulled. Weight falls on something, it pulls a little string, and that lifts through a pulley at the top of the table. So again, those are different ways you can think about energy transferring through a Rube machine. Okay, next what we're going to talk about, the last kind of principle of a Rube machine. This doesn't come down so much to how the machine works, but it's all about visibility and how you're going to present your machine to your audience, which is your classmates, whoever's watching your video. So you have to think a little bit ahead of how you're going to video your machine. You might not want to make steps that are so small that you can't physically zoom in far enough to see how they're working. And you want to avoid hidden things. So let's say if you're going to be filming from your perspective right now, you wouldn't want to have a ball sitting behind an object where it rolls across and you can't see what's happening. So you want to try to design things so maybe they're all stretched out in a line so it's easy to follow them with a camera. And on the other end of that, you don't want to make things too big in general. Let's say you had a string pulled here and it went all the way across the other room to trigger something. Well, you're not physically going to be able to move your camera fast enough to go see what's happening on the other end of your machine. In general, you just want to think about your audience, how you're going to show what's happening. And then the other big thing with that, and we struggled a lot with this in our college competition, is not making your steps go too fast. Because what can happen is if your whole machine runs in 2 seconds, your audience doesn't get a chance to see what's actually happening. So you want to try to make things where if you're going to have a ball roll, try not to have it going so fast all the way across the room that you can't possibly keep up with it with a camera, or having your steps so close together that step 1 triggers 2, triggers 3 within a half a second, and you can't really see what's going on. So it's just another thing to keep in mind as you're building your machines. Okay, next we're going to do a little question and answer session about some different aspects of building a Rube Goldberg machine. So first question, what would you consider to be a good or achievable goal? So Rube Goldberg kind of started out with the idea of doing something practical with the machine. So the end task or goal was always something, some sort of everyday task. And so that's something you might consider trying to do. you're definitely going to want to keep it simple. So, for example, an everyday task might be to change a light bulb, but that's going to be something pretty complicated to get a machine to unscrew a light bulb and screw another one in. That's going to be well beyond the scope of what you're going to want to try to do, and especially if this is one of your first machines. But other things you might consider, like salting food or opening a book, dispensing a piece of candy, something like that that's simple but yet has some sort of goal to it, something practical. You mainly don't want to, you want to avoid doing something kind of insignificant. Like you wouldn't want your end goal to just have a ball roll off the end of a table, because that doesn't really achieve a whole lot. Okay, next question. Do you have any advice on the best ways to get started? So in general, probably what you're going to want to do is just start brainstorming a little bit with different, not about the machine as a whole, but what different tasks you think or steps you think you can use throughout your machine. You might look around the house for different objects or toys. Maybe there's a specific type of car or toy that you have that you might want to work into your machine. But just get some inspiration for different things you might be able to achieve. And once you're at that step, then you might be able to start making a general plan of maybe sketch out you want to do, these 5 or 6 steps in this order, and connect how you're going to connect them together. But you also want to remain flexible, because there's going to be things that you're going to try to do and they're probably not going to work out exactly like you think. And so you might have to change your plan as you're going through. But just experiment, trial and error, figure out what works for you. Yeah. Next question. Would you work backwards from a goal or try to work forward? So basically that is, do you want to start with your end task in mind, whether that's like turning on a light switch, and build your steps backwards from that to the beginning of the machine, or start at the beginning and build the other direction? My opinion that really either way is fine. Most of the times when we were building our machines for college, we'd have lots of people working on them. So we would all kind of do our own things and then put them together at the end. But it is, like I said, good to have a general plan of what you'd like to do. The one thing with that is, if you do have a very specific fixed location for your final task, let's say you were turning on the kitchen sink, that's one where you might want to start from the end, from the faucet, and work your way back. Because if you started on the other end of the kitchen with the beginning of your machine, and you get to the task right before turning on the faucet and you're too far away from the faucet, that could be a bad thing. So that might be where you want to work backwards if you have a fixed location for your final step. Next question. Are there common mistakes to watch out for? I would say that generally goes back to what we talked about before about reliability and setup accuracy. Those are really the main ones that everyone struggles with. Just finding steps that can be done consistently, that are going to work about the same way every time, and finding ways to set up your machine so that every time you trigger it, the same thing happens. And that way, as you're experimenting, it's not about getting lucky, it's about getting it right. So, all right, next one. How big should the machine be? Should it use a large area like a room or a smaller space? I don't know that there's really a right and a wrong answer to that, but there are some considerations to think about. One of the first ones, again, if you're going to use a whole room, you really need to be conscious about how you're going to video it, like we talked about before. So if you have lots of fast steps happening in a big room all over the place, you're not going to be able to get that all on video. The other thing, just from a practical standpoint, is if you're going to build in your parents' living room and you have younger brothers and sisters running around and your machine needs to be set up for a whole week, that might have some difficulties with getting things knocked over and broken. So in that case, you might want to dedicate a smaller portion of a room or something like that that won't be disturbed. And the main thing with that is you really might consider using like a rigid table or a piece of plywood, something that's pretty sturdy and rigid that you can attach a lot of your steps to, and that might make a good base to build your machine on. For example, it would probably not be best to use like a soft carpeting as your base because things might move and shift around. So that might be another thing to consider. Next question, do you have any recommendation on supplies that are helpful? In general, just use whatever you can find, but you might consider using something like K'NEX or Legos for some of your structures. Those can be nice because rather than like 2x4s, if you cut 2x4s and it's the wrong length, now you have to go cut a whole new 2x4 and it could be a little challenging. Whereas K'NEX or Legos, if you need to add on or change them, they're a lot more flexible and easier to modify. You're going to want to avoid making like really light, weak structures, kind of like we talked about, using paper or something that's not going to be very rigid or sturdy. You might consider like using, if you need a tower or something, to use books or a chair or something that's nice and rigid that won't get bumped and moved around. And then from a practical standpoint, I would avoid using duct tape just because it's very difficult to take apart. It might damage furniture. You really don't want to put duct tape on a chair or cabinets or things like that. So that's where you might use the blue painter's tape, so it doesn't damage things that you're trying to stick to. And it's easier to remove if you need to change things. Next question, do you have any, or no, that's what we just did. Are there physical principles to consider while building a Rube Goldberg machine? I would say really it goes back to what we talked about before with energy transfer. That's the biggest thing with Rube Goldberg machines, is how you're going to transfer energy from one step to the next. So I would say that's the biggest one. Yeah. So yeah, I guess that's about it. I don't think I have any more. So yeah, have fun building your Rube Goldberg machines. Be creative. Good luck.